Well, welcome. My name's Evan Williams. I'm the Cybersecurity Business Group Lead at Microsoft for Australia and New Zealand.
Hi, I'm Dave Edge. I'm a security architect in the cloud for Arinco.
Well, thanks for joining. We've got a great topic here around posture and vulnerability management, and we're going to go through some terms of mitigation. Let's jump into the first one. So the first one here is around, we're saying 14% of customers have legacy or unsupported operating systems. I'll pass over to you, David, to explain what are the customer challenges on overcoming this unsupported risk. What are the potential solutions?
Thanks, Evan. So there's a number of customer challenges in this space. One of the key ones really is around visibility. Customers really struggle with understanding what they have. They don't know what they have, and they don't then know that it's potentially out of date. There's a big dependency or overlap here on legacy apps as well. So in order to update an operating system, you've got to identify whether the application could support that, and the kind of roadmap to do that can be quite lengthy. It can be really expensive as well. So particularly in the context of OT environments, very expensive equipment that has very old operating systems embedded within it. And finally, really just a lack of understanding or ability to articulate the risk that unsupported operating systems introduce into a business. So to generate that momentum to mitigate, there's a lot of work around the communication of the problem to get the business to support upgrades and so forth. So one of the first key actions really is to build that inventory. So there's a number of products in the market that can help with that, but within the Microsoft ecosystem, Defender for Cloud, Defender for Endpoint, Defender for IoT particularly, can both discover and flag virtual machines and devices running legacy OSs. And in terms of communicating the risk, it can be really helpful, along with from those products, the various dashboards and things that help to sort of sell the picture, is really explaining that did you know, for example, to the business that your most critical business app is running on an unpatchable operating system, what that means, and did you know that was exposed to the internet, for example? What's the scenario that the business should be prepared for as a consequence of this, to really kind of garner that momentum to change. There's in line with the legacy apps, problem is about what to do next. They might understand that there's an issue, but there are a number of ways really to look at options in terms of rehosting, replatforming, refactoring, re-architecting, replacing. These are, I think Microsoft referred to the 5 R's, but this is about that app modernization pace. And there's a theme throughout here about security issues. The depth of the footprint of the problem is significantly easier to manage in the cloud. So really looking at this from what can the business gain by modernization, but also what security risks can you mitigate. So it's a really strong area that needs attention ultimately to sort of get out of the current state. But accepting that there is a current state and there's a tail to modernization. Looking at things to segment the network and identity boundaries. So introducing least access, introducing minimal network paths or firewalls and ports, hardening systems to a degree. There's still the ability to harden these platforms even if they're unsupported. And there's always the ability to monitor, with IoT, for example, the ability to stick things on network gateways rather than agents that give you visibility into what's happening.
That's right. I love that. And you spoke right up front around it's really difficult to understand the inventory. So you've really got to spend time, get your processes in place to understand that, and then you can implement some of the tools and processes that you went through. Love that. And I also loved how you started to touch on some of it's really important to keep zero trust principle in mind. Keep that low. Make sure that you're on top of where the vulnerabilities are. So that's great. Let's move to the second mitigation. So 2% of customers here, they're seeing resources are exposed to public access. So Yeah, this is a growing area of concern, Dave, with AI technologies now in the mix and will increasingly become more and more part of the mix. Can you take us through some of the actionable steps for customers to ensure their resources are secure?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think some of the challenges here are around the lack of visibility of what's exposed, particularly in the cloud. You spoke about AI, is the ability that, attackers can use those discovery platforms to find things a lot more quickly. And the effort involved in doing an initial discovery from an attacker's perspective is cheap, is relatively easy. So as a defender, as an organization, you at least need to be aware of what they can see. So there's a lot of variety here in terms of different environments and platforms, etc. But I'm just going to concentrate, assuming that we're talking about Azure here for a moment. But one of the key tools for to identify what attackers can see is to use something like the ESAM, or External Attack Surface Management tool, which effectively gives you the ability to identify things from the outside, so internet-facing assets, your domains, subdomains, the IP addresses associated with the organization, and those corresponding services which could be vulnerable to attack. There's also some really good tools from an IT or management perspective to identify public IPs and ports. So the Network Security Dashboard in Azure Monitor, as an example, is a really good way of kind of bringing together the configuration, if you like, of various resources and seeing, in a single place whether they're consistently implemented. So, you might have storage groups with private access configured, and you can see quickly whether or not that's the case across all storage accounts, for example. Yeah. Reviewing, that access to critical resources. So there's a lot of stuff here, but some of the key ones that have got sensitive data that are really worth paying attention to are, as I mentioned, storage accounts, key vaults, databases, PaaS services, and of course VMs. So really looking at those in the first instance. Using, again, this goes back to asset management. There's a real theme throughout here about that problem, but understanding that what are these workloads? What's the sensitivity of data that's stored or processed in those? So using Azure tags to really manage and assign those key value pairs to make that ongoing compliance and monitoring easier. And finally, we can enforce the configuration drift, what we'll talk a bit about in a second, but with potentially different users in the business or different communities able to spin up resources, you've delegated that from a central IT kind of model. You need to really enforce those secure patterns. So using things like Azure policy to dictate really what some of the non-negotiables are. So some of those storage account configurations or key vaults that you really shouldn't be having or expected to have. So that's a really good way to scale and to manage across an environment which can be quite lengthy or significant.
And complex, yeah. Just again, that theme of getting on top of your assets, to manage your assets, what's exposed to public access, it just seems like a core principle to be able to then act and get your processes and tools to address the concern. And obviously it's ever changing, so you need to have that consistent process in place. Let's move to third mitigation now. So this is talking about insecure Active Directory configuration. So we're seeing that 47% of customers here from the report had this in an insecure manner. With such a large number of customers, can you explain what actions can you take as you look at this, and how do you get on top of this security concern?
Yeah, so Active Directory and traditional Active Directory in this context it's a complex product. It's had a footprint in huge numbers of organizations, and it does a lot of stuff. So hence the technical footprint, the potential for vulnerabilities to affect a number of systems. This is where these kind of real extinction level events often accumulate. It really is in some sort of identity-based attack, and an Active Directory is kind of at the heart of that. So getting understanding the importance of domain controllers in this context, and the power that they have, the damage that can be caused by not having some of these basic principles employed to reduce the risk in the environment, is really, really significant. What we also find is that the Active Directory product line as such has been around for a long time. So there's a lot of technical debt there. There's a lot of differences. People have been managing things in different ways. There's a lot of drift between naming standards and conventions and the way that things have been configured. So it can be a hard problem. There's a lot of tech debt there to kind of undo. And in all honesty, a lot of time and money could be spent undoing that, where the business doesn't necessarily see a lot of the value there. So at the moment, what we tend to look at is rather than remediating the swamp, as we often refer to it, we want to look at those strategies to migrate to a cloud-based identity and access management platform and approach that, Entra ID or Azure Active Directory. But we're often stuck with an AD environment for a significant period of time. So there are definitely things that can be done or should be done to kind of minimise the current state. First one is to run a security assessment tool. There are several in the market outside of just the Microsoft other vendors that provide some very good analysis of your environment and actionable steps to take. The choices after that really are about how to remediate. So there's some very effective remediation steps which can be automated by running security configuration wizards and security compliance manager templates and so on. There's a big overlap here with the least privileged admin model. So people operate in IT with less so now with PIM and other products in Azure AD, but with every or significant number of people being over permissioned. So really almost no one should be using a domain admin account, and ways to kind of help mitigate that would be to restrict where domain admins can actually log on, leaving their credentials or footprints available on machines that might be vulnerable for lateral movement following kind of phishing attacks and so on. So multiple ways to get into the environment, but just implementing some of those basics around permissioning can really reduce the exposure that the organization might have. RDP connections from authorized hosts, those kind of management access points. Another key one is blocking internet access and removing the legacy domain controller environments. So being able to step up some of the security features, removing some of the legacy security protocols can only be done once you've eliminated some of those legacy DCs. And of course patching those. So all of those things are probably eminently doable. It's just about having the dedicated time and effort to really target this problem area. But it's crucially important. Finally, the really good one to identify when things are happening. We talk about threat actors being able to live off the land and live in environments for prolonged periods of time without being discovered. If you can install Defender for Identity, you can really, it's a significant, some of these tools require a fair amount of technical expertise. With Defender for Identity, you just get that visibility of some of these quite complex exploits and attacks happening in the environment. It will surface things like irregular attack patterns, brute force attempts, pass the ticket, pass the hash type stuff, privilege escalation, all of that sort of stuff gets surfaced, and you can then take some response on the back of seeing that stuff's going on in the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a challenge, isn't it? As customers are looking to move to the cloud, they're through this absolute period of still having on-premise, and then you look at the complexity of then managing that least privileged admin model you've got on-premise and cloud. So yeah, that was some great examples of how to stay on top of that. Let's move to the fourth mitigation here around insecure operating system configuration. So 3% of customers here were found to have this insecure environment. What are some of the challenges you've seen here, and what are some of the actions customers can take?
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, it's a smaller number than I was expecting, actually. One of the reasons is that organizations, this can be quite a tricky area to configure platforms and operating systems securely. So kind of nobody wants this job where you're going to run a secure config thing and then it's going to break stuff. So traditionally it's been sort of left alone. It's a fairly thankless task, a little bit like vulnerability management in general. Yep. It's also, some of these settings can be quite esoteric, so it can be hard to gain a consensus of what good looks like. You spend a lot of time going, we need to have this thing set to this, and there's a bit of back and forth. And regardless of that, then over time, people tend to set and forget these things. So you might have something that you produced for Windows 7 and you get to Windows 10 and you just lift and shift the thing without looking at whether or not it's still appropriate. That happens, stuff changes it drifts over time, or it's just not set consistently. So you deploy a new thing and it's just not there. So the key actions in response to some of those challenges from our perspective is, really need our baseline. The 80-20 rule, I think, applies here, where you're looking at, you need to employ something, and something's better than nothing. So, getting something like the Windows 365 security baseline and the security baselines for Windows 4 endpoints, for example, via Intune, are really good baseline starting points. They may not be the most hardened, the best for every environment, but having something, including some of those CIS type recommendations or benchmarks, is really important, and working from there as a sort of maturity approach. On Azure, and with hybrid environments using Azure Arc, we've got Microsoft Defender for Cloud to check the configuration of those key workloads, so Linux, Windows, Docker workloads, etc. Yeah. And again, those compare that configuration with the Azure security baseline configuration. So you're accepting that Microsoft have done a fair amount of homework, have given a fairly generalized view of what good looks like, and use that as a starting point. And then enforce that stuff. So desired state config. A lot of name changes happening, as we all know, using what's now Azure Auto Managed Machine Configuration. Bit of a mouthful, but that's where we start. And using, as I mentioned, that issue of drift over time or not having things set at all. Using Auto Manage actually can automate that process of onboarding, configuration, and monitoring for drift. So some of the key ones there. There's also a fair amount that can be done for OT. It's a different environment, it's a different problem to a degree. But even there, some basic things around default passwords, using different passwords across that type of environment. And again, back to that identity and network separation, limiting network ingress and egress, etc.
Yeah, sometimes this is an area that is overlooked, and 3% surprised me as well. But I think you went through some great things. You can look to automate this environment as much as you can, but stay on top of it. Let's move to the fifth mitigation. So here we're looking at 30% of customers have no vulnerability management solution in place. And this is a number that surprised me, given how critical this solution is. And we've seen the success of ransomware attacks just jump recently. So to have 30% here still vulnerable, what should you be thinking about here to get on top of this and reduce the risk of managing vulnerability?
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, I think that number reflects the ongoing key challenges around the vulnerability management space. It's a fairly thankless task. You don't get thanked for doing it well, but you get beaten up when it goes badly. We also refer to vulnerability management. We'll explain this probably in two halves. From this perspective, we're talking about focusing on the vulnerability identification. So lots of organizations do the identification well. They know that they've got lots of problems, but they don't do the remediation or the patch management part very well. So we'll have a tool that does something. We know we've got a load of issues, but and this comes down to some of the root causes here is a lack of ownership of the process. So particularly in OT, whose job is it? Whose job is it to identify something? Whose job is it to then remediate? Whose job is it to govern? And what we find is that there has been in most organisations a prolonged period of a lack of governance. So we've kind of been showing data, but we've not been articulating its real impact or potential impact. We've not been identifying people in the business that have the pockets, the resources to help to really drive some of the actions and activity, which in some cases can be an A-team type approach to really going and targeting critical and high type issues across the organisation or a subset. So to some of the actions, we also, sorry, I should have mentioned that a lot of organisations have a complex environment. So removing that complexity, we've got too many platforms basically. So removing and simplifying that environment can just reduce the footprint and the vulnerability management challenge. So that's the first thing, is review whether or not there's the opportunity longer term to consolidate environment. The same tools are applicable here in terms of the asset management issue. So Azure Inventory, Intune, Defender for IoT, all of those give a view of, what's there, what's the current state of vulnerability management in terms of criticality. They also provide some excellent context and potential ways to digest that information to prioritize vulnerabilities and visualize the exploitability of an attack. So you can really sort of understand, well, we've got a big mass of stuff here. Where do we start? So those kind of tools, identifying the problem and then providing some guidance around where to start, can be born from there. Again, we've also been tripped up by having different views on what our requirements are. So what is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of SLAs? So is it remediating stuff within a week, 2 weeks, 48 hours? What's the thing? And agreeing on what the thing is, so that we know, what's good enough for now, what do we need to do later? Really having a frank and honest discussion about, what we need to do, rather than setting unachievable targets that nobody realistically can meet with the resources they have. Aligned with that really is around identifying the roles and responsibilities, so people are actually organised and take responsibility for the action. So without that kind of without those processes and baselines in place, it's going to be really difficult to kind of manage this problem. I've mentioned a couple of products around Defender for Threat and Vulnerability Management and IoT. Another one for Azure is the Cloud Security Posture Management. So above the foundational components, that exploitability and attack paths, and also there's the data discovery creeping in there to identify whether there is information residing in some of these resources that should be resolved before others on the basis of some highly confidential information. So again, using the tools that are there, you can get an awful lot of information that can help to prioritize what can be a fairly large activity. And finally, some cases, again, back to the OT constraint, we have to look at segmentation or other maybe virtual patching type mechanisms to deal with the fact that we just can't patch some of this stuff because it's end of life or out of support. And in terms of the governance issue, establishing those compliance and reporting processes. So routine reporting of how good a job, how we're doing, how we're tracking, again, all within the Defender for Endpoint, having a single environment console to track rather than multiple spreadsheets, multiple systems that data needs to be amalgamated in. It's a very much more manageable problem with a single platform approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I love you just went through 7 points around the vulnerability management strategy. And you spoke really well to both process and the tools that you can use. But in the end, you really, again, are going to make a judgment. Your risk-based approach, what vulnerabilities you want to stay on top of, which ones you're going to therefore put all this in place on. So that was great. We're on to the sixth one and final one in this section. We've got here, we're talking about missing or inconsistent update management. So the report found that 43% of customers have a challenge in this area. There are a number of solutions that can help, again, but we're still finding that 46% of customers, which is a large number, are not doing it. What are your thoughts and suggestions here?
So a number of challenges here. That number's unsurprising. That as with config management, we're worried about breaking things. We have this slow patching life cycle typically, where we might do a dev environment first, then a sort of staging environment, then production. So we can go, these days that life cycle of weeks to months is significant for the pace at which attackers can move. So being able to shorten that life cycle, being a bit more aggressive about accepting changes and a bit of risk with downtime if things need to be rolled back. Generally, the world's moved on a bit. Microsoft have done incredible work to make sure that the integrity of patches and things that are released aren't destructive, and so we can begin to look at more automated and aggressive patching regimes as a result, which I'll come on to as well. In terms of where we are, though, nobody wants this kind of job either. We've got that. You touched it last. It's your problem to remediate. We don't want to do that on a Friday before a weekend, etc. So, that kind of that issue and long-term neglect. Just a mass of kind of unpatched systems and where to start, knowing if something's actually patched or has failed to patch, and a lot of the time the effort is because there's a lot of manual process and potentially across multiple teams. So really coordinating the activity and verification is just painful and difficult. And at the end of the day, some of that stuff is related to legacy apps or operating systems. We might be patching Microsoft stuff very well, but we might have applications and services that are just that are difficult. So a number of challenges. Not going to pretend that this is all easily fixable, but one of the key ways to get out of this problem is to abstract away from managing the tin and wires. So shift the responsibility of kind of infrastructure to a CSP and focus on higher value services, workloads, applications, and data. That really should be the end goal. So you can just remove yourself from being burdened by that problem. But accepting where we are, you can get an awful lot of visibility. Again, using something like Defender for Endpoint, it's multi-platform. We can get everything, vulnerabilities in one place, get that visibility of what's patched and what isn't. Using Windows Auto Patch, a fantastic tool on endpoint devices via Intune to automate, set and forget, if you like, the configuration of patching on devices. So if there's a breaking patch, Microsoft will roll it back, highlights machines that haven't patched. It's really powerful. The same thing applies in Azure on VM guest patching on servers. So just that set and forget, there's things that can be easily enabled nowadays to just get these things patched when patches are released. And that can go a long way towards lifting secure scores and other components that demonstrate that these problems are being well managed. In terms of apps, using Defender for Endpoint to mark up sanctioned apps or MCAS or Defender for Cloud apps, using those to manage the apps that are in the environment, tag those with criticality and data sensitivity, being able to identify those that are auto patch configured so they can update themselves, or manually configuring alerts or configuring alerts to notify on critical and high, so you can take some remediation action, repackage an application with the latest version, etc.
Dave, that was brilliant. We just went through 6 mitigations within posture and vulnerability management. Some fantastic insights and some actions for customers to take in this key topic. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. Thanks for having me.